Hi, I'm Eric, and this is episode 1 of the Nobody Yet podcast. As I'm recording this, it's Thursday, November 14th at 10:08 p.m. On this episode, I want to cover a couple lessons that I've learned in the past 2 years, and these are the 2 years after graduating university and entering the workforce for the first time in a full-time position. Now, before I dive into those lessons, you may be wondering, what is this? So to give some context, I actually did this podcast with a couple friends of the same name a couple years ago during peak COVID. So this was 2020. And during this time, we just recorded episodes with each other where we talked a lot about our thoughts and different insights and different lessons that we had. And it was just really fun at the time. It was peak COVID. We had nothing to do. Other people were recording TikToks, YouTube, whatever. We were doing podcasts. And over time, we also brought on guests and they shared their stories. We learned lessons. Overall, it was just a really cool, fun project. Now, the project eventually stopped around 2021 because I moved to New York and I had many other priorities or pressing thoughts that I was kind of working through, mainly exploring New York and giving into hedonic pleasures. So that was why this podcast first stopped 3 years ago. And despite it stopping, I always thought about this project. My mind would drift back to thinking of starting it again, where I could really just document my thoughts and chronicle my life as I live through my 20s. So here I am now. This is what this podcast is. This podcast is going to be filled with me, just talking to me. It's basically me staring at the window, just talking with some notes in my hand. And in these episodes where it's just me, like I mentioned, notes in my hand, I'll just be covering some thoughts, reflections, lessons, experiences, ideas from other social media, just anything that I've consumed or thought about in the past week or period of time. I guess with this podcast, there's 3 goals. The first 2 goals, I will admit, are pretty selfish. So the first goal is to document who I was at this specific point in time. And this is really just to fossilize all my thoughts and all my reflections so that future me, when I'm 30 or 35, I could come back to this podcast or very much like these diary entries and think about, wow, that was Eric at that age. And just something to think about. I find it really difficult to imagine who I was when I was 15 or when I was 20. And I think there's often a hindsight bias as well. Often the outcomes skew my perceptions of who I was in the past. And I'm trying to avoid that bias. So I'm trying to give myself the most unfiltered view of myself that I could reflect back on in the future and be proud of who I became. So I guess in that sense, this is me reacting in real time to everything that's happening in my life, whether it be good, bad, whatever. It's just me at this moment with my thoughts. The second reason is, I guess, an extension of the first, but it's for me in the present. So I tend to think I have too many thoughts in my head, and because I think about a lot of things and perhaps things are a little too deeply, my thoughts tend to get very jumbled. That's why I started writing in the first place. I started writing as kind of an antidote to all my jumbled thoughts and really break the chain of circular thinking that I often have of just one thought leading to another, which leads back to the original thought, and it just kind of becomes this human centipede of just thoughts. So this is very much a way, in parallel to my writing, to just really formulate my thoughts a little bit better and to make it a little bit more linear, a little bit more understandable and concrete. So this is very much for me in the present as well. Now, from those 2 reasons leads to my third reason, and I guess I hope this podcast has some help for you, the listener. I find a lot of things I'm thinking about, I honestly don't know if anyone else is thinking about them. I know from some close friends that they have similar thoughts, but those are only the close friends, like 5 or 3 or whatever, that I know have these thoughts. I find it's very difficult to talk about these things in just normal everyday situations, obviously, because A, not everyone thinks like this, and then B, it's always not like the right time and place to talk about deeper things or just like ideas that you're playing around with, and not everyone is receptive to it at that time. So I'm really also just recording this, hopefully as a resource for you, to also feel like you're not alone with any thoughts that you have, and just also feel like you have a resource to refer to. This is not supposed to be some document of truth. I'm pretty young. I'm 25. There's still a lot of things that I'm working through and I don't understand fully. And I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts that I have that are very naive, that are really sugar coated and are very immature given my age and given that I haven't just experienced a lot of life yet relative to those who are 30, 35, or 40. So, in this sense, I hope this podcast serves as kind of like a companion that grows as you grow as well. And that kind of lends itself to the idea of nobody yet. Not that I'm trying to shoot to become somebody, but I'm trying to become somebody that I could be happy with. I'm trying to be somebody that I could say, hey, that person lived an ideal life and a meaningful life and a good life. So this is nobody yet. I mentioned this earlier, but in front of me, I just have a note sheet and I try to do this all in one take. So the whole idea is to go over my notes, fill in those gaps, and to do so kind of with my first reaction and just to do it really naturally. I'm trying not to edit this and trying not to make it fake. I'm just trying to make this as genuine as possible. So I'll warn you beforehand, there might be a lot of tangents or running thoughts. That is all, I guess, by design or maybe laziness, depending how you look at it. But that is what that is. Now the episodes with guests. So I'll do something very similar, like the previous iterations of the project, where I'll bring guests on and we'll just talk about different things that they've dealt with or different lessons they've had and where they're at now. And hopefully we can share ideas and just learn about each other. I think it's very cool learning about people in general. It's kind of like living lives that you don't otherwise get to live. And I think that's very valuable. So hopefully I'll bring on some guests every once in a while. So you're not just stuck with me listening to me rambling on about my thoughts. But yeah, that's what this is. But with that said, lessons learned in the past 2 years. And in many ways, it feels like right now I'm in a junction in life. A lot of things changed in the past month. I actually wanted to record this a while ago, but it was just really chaotic and all the things happening that I felt best to push it back. But in the past month, I quit my job, my first job at university, and found another one. I moved out of Chicago into New York City, where I've always wanted to be for the past 4 years since I first came to the city in 2021. Started a new job, so there's a lot of ramping up to do in the new job. And I also recently turned 25, so kind of a quarter life benchmark, if you will. So a lot of things happened in the past month. And I thought right now would be a good time to really lock in the lessons I learned in the past 2 years as I look ahead for my life in New York. So the past 2 years, I went to Chicago to work at a trading firm in finance. And it was kind of the culmination of all my work in university. In university, I really wanted to go into big tech, and I got into big tech as an internship and realized it wasn't for me. Then I went into big unicorn companies, startups, and realized that wasn't for me either. And then kind of the pinnacle of it was I then wanted to go into trading, and I got into trading and I think I realized it's not for me. And it feels like all throughout university, I was always looking for what's more. And in university, I was really focused on status and on money. And that culminated in working at a trading firm for the past 2 years. So now I'm a little bit free of those shackles and like to proceed with the first lesson. And the first lesson that I've learned is that it's okay to be unhappy. When I think of happiness now, I think of happiness in kind of two frames. There's the micro frame of happiness, micro meaning the day by day, and there's the macro. So this is, I like to think of the macro as the overall attitude I have towards my trajectory. I have high macro happiness if I am really bullish or I'm very hopeful on where I'm going to go in life and my future. And this is along many dimensions. career, maybe skill progression, family, friends, the whole package. This is everything. And now I like to think of happiness in these two frames. Growing up, I never really had expectations from my parents. They never really forced me to play instruments I didn't want to play. I never learned piano growing up. I never learned violin. I never got put into classes I just didn't want to do. Of course, I did enrichment programs, but kind of embarrassingly enough, they were kind of on my own volition, that I wanted to do them myself as a kid. But my parents really instilled this general idea of always want to pursue happiness, and the biggest goal in life is to be happy. And there's not that much flaws in that understanding. It's actually a really good message that I'm really happy that they instilled in me growing up. But this kind of met a different shift as soon as I entered, I guess, early adulthood post university. Adulthood, or working a full time job, really has a different paradigm compared to university. I felt working was at a pace much more determined by me, which meant that the pace was often much slower. In university, there was a structure of problem sets and then exams, and it culminates in kind of exam season, and then you restart all over again as you progress through each semester, through each year until graduation. So it kind of feels like there's this routine of high vigor that you're always kind of running. And adulthood is not really like that. Adulthood, at least in the past 2 years, I felt like there were some instances of running, like when I really need to meet a deadline at work, I felt like I was just spending so much time. Or if I was going on vacation for an extended period of time, it felt like I was driving 300 miles an hour as I was vacationing and traveling to different places. But majority of the times, the Mondays through Fridays is really just me going to work, coming home, doing whatever at night, and then sleeping to go to work tomorrow. And then weekends, a lot of it is kind of just recovering from work, and just relaxing. And in the schedule of adulthood, I really fell into comfort. And kind of going back to the framework of happiness, kind of I like to think of now, um, I began to have less macro happiness despite having the rewards of my previous effort. Because I worked so hard in university, I had a very fortunate outcome. But despite having that outcome and actively living that outcome on the day to day, I felt like I was just not happy when I was thinking about my trajectory. In a sense, there's this really deep rooted fear that this was all life was. It was just wake up, work, go home, and sleep. And that felt really cold to me, and it felt really hopeless. And lacking in that macro happiness, I tried to really compensate with micro happiness. This is kind of getting my brain off of things, if you will, or trying not to think that much. This was me going out, drinking, playing video games here and there, trying to find hobbies, which of course is not a bad thing, but really just trying to find distractions for me to actually address the bigger problem, which is the macro attitude that I have towards my trajectory of life. And after I would pursue these activities, going out, doing whatever, I always felt a sense of emptiness. Even though I had a lot of fun, there's always some regret and the emptiness there that came after. It felt like I still wasn't making progress towards the overarching theme of where I want to pursue in life. I was stuck in Chicago. That was not a city I want to stay in. And I was stuck in my job, and that was not a job I wanted to stay in long term. But the comfort and the delusion of pursuing all these micro instances of happiness really kind of sedates that unhappiness that I have towards the overall trajectory of where my life is going. It was very difficult for me to accept that I was unhappy with my trajectory. And it was much easier succumbing to the micro happiness pursuits, the things that are a little bit more hedonic because they're much easier. In this sense, maybe going back to the framework, I like to think of happiness maybe now as 4 quadrants. You could have low, micro, and macro unhappiness, which is, of course, something that we always want to avoid. There is the low macro happiness and high micro happiness, which I experienced, where it felt a little bit hopeless. Things felt really fleeting. It felt like I always had to fill some unsatiable appetite that I always had. So I always had to be doing things, pursuing hobbies, doing things that I knew were frivolous, but still had to be done, and my schedule had to be filled, so that there's not empty spaces where I just lie in bed or I'm just sitting there thinking about what I could do or what greater arching progress that I can make. Eventually, as I came to finally accept that I was unhappy, I found myself in the quadrant of low micro happiness, but a lot of macro happiness. And for me, this was very much the final, let's say, like 8 months of the last 2 years, where I started focusing on overarching themes um, that I wanted changed in my life. That was moving out of Chicago. That was finding a new job. That was more aggressively pursuing hobbies that I really enjoyed, like powerlifting. These were all things that really took away from the micro happiness. Instead of coming home from work and being able to do whatever, I came home from work and I just did more work. Of course, not work in the sense of me working at a job, but I did recruiting work. I tightened up my resume. I had to do leak code. I had to read textbooks about system design. There's so many things that I was doing at that point where my automatic answer towards all the outlets that I had previously for micro happiness was essentially no. I didn't go out anymore because I didn't have time to do so. I didn't do hobbies anymore because I didn't have time to do so. I just didn't do anything other than obsess over recruiting and getting out of that situation that I was in. This is that quadrant of low micro happiness, just not being happy with the day to day, but being very happy and being very hopeful with the long term. And there's this high sense of potency in that. I think there's always this huge focus, and maybe if I go on a little tangent here, there's this huge focus on how happy we should be on the day to day. And that was a huge focus that I had growing up, and a huge focus I had in the past 1 year and 3 months, until I finally sat with myself and said, me being happy right now and not thinking about my trajectory or my future is really just putting off the cost. It's as if I'm paying interest on kind of the happiness debt that I have, that in the future, I would, let's say if I continue at this job at the city, I would eventually end up in a place where I regretted the past decade or 2 decades of my life. And that feeling of unhappiness would be much, much greater than any unhappiness that I could feel now. That it's far greater than any sacrifice that I could feel now, or any discomfort that I could feel now. It's that sense of hopelessness that I can no longer change the past, and now I'm old and I don't have energy and I have responsibilities and things are less dynamic. That sense of cost long term is something very scary. And that fear really plays in this quadrant of being unhappy in the short term and happy in the long term. In this sense, I felt like staying in this quadrant for a long time, or kind of first entering this quadrant, is really uncomfortable. It really sucks starting to say no to a lot of things. It really sucks not being able to do a lot of things that I did previously. Even though powerlifting was one of my main hobbies that I enjoy, I stopped going to the gym that often, or I couldn't spend so much time in the gym anymore because everything was focused on recruiting, getting out of that situation that I was in that I didn't like. But slowly over time, there's momentum that is built. The initial discomfort and the cost that needs to be paid eventually just evaporates. I felt like I kind of got used to that everyday trudge of work. Go work out for a little bit, come home, eat, and then continuously work. And then weekends, it'll just be work. And then weekdays, same thing. So it's very much the same schedule that I had, except all the free time was just now dedicated towards work. Staying in on nights, staying in on Fridays, and staying in on Saturdays kind of felt good because I knew that I was putting my time that I could have spent elsewhere into my future, a future that I actually liked. and that was more ideal for me. So there is a sense of momentum that's built. There's also the feeling of unhappiness in the present, and the micro unhappiness kind of stokes a sense of anger. It's kind of like, oh, I'm so angry that I'm unhappy right now that I'm going to make sure that all my efforts that I put into my macro is not wasted. And that I'm going to make sure with all my effort and with all my conviction that I will achieve whatever I want to achieve, because this cost that I'm paying right now and the sacrifice I'm giving right now is too much and I don't want it to go to waste. So there's also that sense that kind of comes up in this momentum as it's being driven towards, hopefully, long-term happiness, and also like long-term or short-term micro happiness as well, which is that fourth quadrant. In this sense, maybe a final word in this is that unhappiness and the ability to accept being unhappy becomes a very powerful source of fuel. Unhappiness gives the momentum, and it also gives that sense of intensity that it takes to break out of the current situation, the current comfort that's in. It's kind of like the pain of staying the same is far greater than the pain of change, especially when I finally found that I stewed and I really sulked in the unhappiness and felt the unhappiness really just seep into my spirit. That's when I finally noticed that I need to absolutely change, for I can no longer bear it anymore. Maybe to go off a tangent again, this kind of relates to the region beta paradox, where I wrote about this before in one of my previous essays. It's also known as the golden handcuffs, but it's kind of like usually people are better off with the present situations being worse off, because with the situations being worse off, it motivates change. It's kind of like living in a apartment, which is okay, but it's not terrible. So it doesn't really motivate someone to go through all the discomfort of moving all their belongings, finding a new place, and then settling in a new place. But let's say if the current living situation is really terrible, there's a leak on the floor, there's holes in there's leaks in the ceiling, there's holes on the floor, then it really the situation is so bad that it forces the person to move out of that place, take the cost of finding somewhere else, and move into a better situation. So it's kind of the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of being different. But that is all to say, unhappiness really motivates and really pushes, pushes me out of that comfort of staying the same. So the lesson here is the sooner to accept unhappiness is the sooner to have action. It's okay to be unhappy. The second lesson I learned is that everyone is optimizing for different things. And when I mean optimizing for different things, I think of this in many dimensions. The first dimension is the largest, and it's life outlook. It's how we each define what an ideal life is. Do we think an ideal life is just a quiet life full of friends and family? Is an ideal life one in which there are great euphoria and great tragedy? Is it one that is focused on travel? Is it one that's focused on work? What does an ideal life look like? And that life looks different for everyone. And as a result of it looking different from everyone, everyone would also have a different set of values for that life outlook. Another sense is perspective. Kind of following in the frame of having different life outlooks, people are also raised differently, and people also have different genes from one another, which I'm sure both contribute towards the development of perspective that different people have. An example of this is the purpose of work. Growing up, I met a lot of people, my parents included, who see work more as a function of security and as a function of just living. You need to work to live, because you need money to live, and you need money to live a happy life. And there's nothing wrong with any perspective that people have, but these could be fundamentally different from the ones I have. And that, of course, result in us optimizing for different things. Another one is expectations. And expectations becomes a pretty important one when we think about happiness and when we think of reality. Of course, the quote always goes, happiness is the difference between reality and expectation. But if people have different expectations, it makes it kind of hard to gauge what my own expectations should be. An example of this is our company bonus. So at the end of each year, there's some value that's a bonus that's given to everyone. And it varies per person, but generally it is some similar value for people who started early on, like me. And I remember one year, and this is the year I left, and I didn't leave because of the bonus, but when the final year bonus was announced, I remember talking to the few friends I have at the company, and we shared our numbers, and people were generally dismayed by it. They weren't really satisfied with it. They felt the firm did really good. It felt it was a bit low relative to previous years. They felt it could be more. It was lower relative to industry, whatever thoughts they had. But I guess their expectations were much higher. But for me, when I heard the number, I was actually really happy. I felt like the bonus was a good number, and I was just happy. I'm not a big spender, and as a kid, I never thought I would make even close to what I make today, given that I was supposed to kind of just graduate and work for the government and kind of just live a really stable life as a kid. But that's all to say that the difference in expectations that we have towards our bonuses give us different perceptions on happiness and kind of how we feel life is going. A different sense of optimization is also societal expectations. So everyone has their own expectations or their perspectives and the life outlook. And on top of their own individual opinions, there's kind of like this constant pull of society, where society has certain values and certain expectations that it generally portrays. And I think for me previously, who was a little bit more weak-willed and less willing to walk outside the norm, felt a little bit overbearing and felt like it was something I had to subscribe to. One example of this is work-life balance. In society, work-life balance is highly pushed forward as a good thing. But I think now, and I'll write about this or speak about it sometime later, when I think about work a little bit more, I want to define it for me. I think of work as not something I want to avoid. And I don't think work has a negative connotation. And because of that, I don't think work-life balance is a thing for me. I think of more of work-life harmony. I want work to be my life and my life to be work. I don't see work as a bad thing. And I want work to be a good thing because I want to be passionate about work. And why would you not want to do anything that you're not passionate in? But that's kind of all to say that societal's expectations of work-life balance conflicts with my individual understanding of how I want to work and how I want to see my work. And that kind of creates a rift and kind of a certain sense of pain, diverging from the cultural norm and diverging from most people. So what does like all this difference in optimization means? I think for me, the biggest consequence of noticing that everyone has a different sense of optimization is a feeling of loneliness. It's kind of difficult to find people who are optimizing for similar things as me, especially if I notice that the things I'm optimizing for are a little bit different from general expectations. Because I no longer think about money as much and status as much, it feels like now a lot of decisions that I'm making maybe don't pertain to a lot of the people that I was surrounded by back in Chicago, or it was just kind of not in the question, the decisions that I was making and kind of the thoughts that are going through my brain. And it's kind of isolating. It kind of feels like you're the only one thinking these things, or you're the only one optimizing for what you're optimizing for. And that's a scary thing. It's difficult to seek advice, and things always need to be taken with heavy grains of salt. That's loneliness. It's isolating. It just sucks. It's painful. And I think this was something that I really had to slowly come into realization. And for me, the solution to this and the thing that I'm actually still working on right now is just having more conviction that I'm going in the right direction. There's kind of a sense of irrational belief that everything will work out okay, no matter how stupid or no matter how different it is from what other people are doing. Just just this dumb belief that it's going to work out okay even if I pursue the only way I optimize for things. That is not to say that I shouldn't seek advice or I didn't seek advice. One of the best things that I had in the past month, as I was kind of going through that change of jobs and deciding between different offers, was reaching out to people who were optimizing similar things as I was, or at least understood where I was coming from, because we were really close and we optimized for similar things before. And they were truly helpful in thinking my next steps and being okay with that decision. Another way of combating loneliness that I need to work more on as I kind of learn this lesson is having friends for different purposes. Also, growing up, I always wanted a very tight-knit group of friends who kind of did everything together. Kind of like chase dreams together, travel together, just have fun together, just shoot our crap together. Just I wanted that solid group of friends who did everything. And that really kind of ironically stifled my social outreach, because it kind of felt like, oh, as soon as this person diverges from me in this core value that I have in pursuing what I want to pursue in life, then this person was like no longer worth talking to, because that person doesn't fit the mold of what I'm looking for. And this is kind of like, it becomes a self-imposed sense of loneliness, and it's kind of stupid in a sense. I'm kind of just really shooting myself in the foot with this. And the solution is just not having a stick up my ass and just being more social, just having friends for different purposes. It's okay if connections are shallow, or it's okay that people are dissimilar to me. There's an acceptance that not everyone will be exactly what I'm looking for, and that's okay. It's probably better to have a close-knit people who you could go for advice, but also just a lot of people that you could talk to and just have fun with. Because, of course, life, a big part of it is just having fun. The third lesson, or I guess maybe to wrap up the second lesson, is that everyone's optimizing for different things. The third lesson is that people are just people. So maybe a summary of high school and university me. I felt like in high school and university, for me, it was best described as a series of stages. In high school, I was in the lowest stage, the stage where I didn't really know what was outside in the world. I didn't know the different good universities there were. I just knew kind of the narrow bounds of my existence in a quiet suburb in Canada. And for me, there was this overall ambition or this overall goal to do something greater, and that was go to a better institution or a better program. And there's a lot of work there. But as I kind of obsessively work after this goal in grade 10 and grade 11, I saw a lot of mentors who, or not a lot, I saw a few mentors, but I saw a lot of people, like stories online or whatever, of people making it to the institutions that I wanted to make to, or that I wanted to get into, or the programs or doing research that I wanted to do that I thought was cool. And these people all seemed like gods. These people seemed not mortal. They seemed like people who were beyond life, or who escaped societal's expectations of what it meant to be a human. I felt like these people could do anything to change the world, that they were not scared, they were immune to failure. I felt like these people were everything that I wanted to be. And kind of in that work, as I obsessively worked, I was chasing that ideal of a person. And as I proceeded from that stage into the next stage, where I was at an okay program, a better program that of what I would have went into if I didn't kind of work really hard during that time, I then had a next goal. And the next goal was getting into the proverbial FANG, or like big tech companies that had high status, comfortable job, and paid pretty good. And I saw everyone or anyone who got a job at these companies, again, as gods, as people who were untouchable and were way smarter than I was. And fortunately, eventually I got there. I got an offer from a company, I worked there, And then from there, I had the next goal, which was work at even more tech companies, but this time not just one, but many in a row. And there's something in my university called a 4-4-4-4, which is you do 4 internships each for 4 months in a row for 16 months. And that was something that I really wanted to do. And I saw the people who did that successfully as, again, gods. Until I was fortunate enough to do it myself. And then kind of you can see this pattern go on. Here's the next step of, oh, well, I work in big tech. What is trading like? And then I saw trading as, or finance as this even more exclusive group that even less people got into with higher status and better rewards. And now I really wanted that. And I saw the people enter as untouchable gods until, fortunately, I got in again. And as I progressed up the ranks, through a lot of luck and just work, of course, there's always a slight disappointment as I reached that level. It's kind of like I got there. I remember I got into the first big tech company, and the first week I remember sitting there and I just thought, this is it? This is what it feels like? It feels no different. Even though I'm at like this really cool company that I dreamed about in the past year, nothing felt different. Like I was still me. I'm still confused. I'm still kind of a dummy. Nothing's changed. It's only kind of the external circumstances have changed. And I felt this in each individual step as I rose up towards the things I wanted to achieve. In this sense, it kind of really broke the glass that I saw as, oh, these are these untouchable people, these elites that could do nothing wrong and who only know success. Now I have a working hypothesis that I kind of stole from another podcast called Modern Wisdom that I listen to a lot. But Chris, the host of the podcast, says it's idiots all the way up. And it's kind of saying how even starting from the lowest level to whatever top of the food chain, however you want to take that analogy, is that everyone at each run of the ladder all don't really know what they're doing. Everyone's a bit confused. Everyone's a bit unsure. Everyone feels failure, and everyone feels fear. No one along this run is invincible. No one has run faster than the humanity that kind of embraces them, that defines them. So no matter how far high you rise, you're still very much human. And I just saw that a lot in the past few years at the trading firm. I finally got into trading, the place I always wanted to be at, and I was around the very people that I chased after in high school. I was messaging, I was working with just people from these elite institutions that I've always wanted to be at. And when I talk to them, they're just normal people. Of course, they're very smart, but they're also very kind, and they also make mistakes, and they're funny, and they're fun, and they're just people. It's not these untouchable people that no one could relate to. In the end, it's just people. I think moving to New York, now this is a little bit cheating because this is not in the past 2 years, but moving to New York recently, there's another experience that just reminds me of it. So last week I was getting brunch with a friend, and in the corner of our brunch place was sitting Bill Ackman and his family. Bill Ackman, if you don't know, is the billionaire hedge fund manager of Pershing Square Capital. And he was just sitting there with his wife and his family and just eating. And this was just a normal brunch place. It wasn't that expensive. And it was just a nice day outside. And I just walked in with my friend and I sat there and just noticed, oh, there he is. And when I saw him, he's just a normal person, right? There's nothing super unique. There's no like luster. In the end, he's still a person, and in the end, he asked for butter and he asked for olive oil, or he asked the waiter for whatever like order that he had. Is not much different from me, who turns out also likes butter and also likes olive oil on bread. But that was a really recent experience that just even more drilled in the fact that everyone from the bottom to the top are all people, And as Chris Williamson of Modern Wisdom says, it's idiots all the way up. People are just people. So those were 3 lessons that I had. Maybe looking forward really quickly are some couple things that I want to actively improve upon and really work on. And this is hopefully kind of like a New Year's resolution sort of thing, except it's not the New Year's, but something hopefully that I could look back on maybe a year from now or 2 years from now and actually see, did I actually work on these things that I told myself I want to work on? But here goes. So the first one I want to work on, and I mentioned this before, is belief. I really want to work on having a deep-rooted belief in myself again. And this really transpired in the previous 2 years where I didn't have that belief. And I didn't have that belief because I was in a place I didn't like. And I felt like I was slipping into a hole that I couldn't really crawl out of. So it kind of corroded that sense of belief, the sense of belief in myself that I needed to actually achieve the different stages that I mentioned earlier. It kind of felt like I was playing an endless game with no goals, that I was just kind of walking blindly into the dark or something. So that's something that I want to work on, is belief. And in the same vein of this is being more bold. Another podcast I listen to a lot is Founders by David Senra. He covers the world's greatest entrepreneurs or athletes or whoever, and kind of distills these life lessons or distills these core experiences from them, and he draws patterns between them. And one common theme was being more bold. Jeff Bezos has a quote that he has in his shareholder letters of, "We will be bold." Winston Churchill has a quote of, "Always more audacity." Across history, it seems like a lot of the greatest entrepreneurs or the greatest leaders and athletes always had that sense of, we will be more bold. We will have more courage. We will have more of that belief. We will have more audacity. And that is something that I want to have an extension towards being more sure with myself, is having that boldness. Another aspect of belief that is common across these entrepreneurs, also taken from that podcast, is belief comes before ability. A lot of these very successful people did not start being successful. And the common example of that is Michael Jordan, who was kicked off his junior varsity team because he wasn't good enough for the basketball team. Of course, now he's known as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, basketball player of all time. But there's like this fundamental belief that he has to have in himself back then, that he will be the best before the evidence actually told him anything, that he will actually be the best. So that's something that I want to see I want to apply in my own life, is having that belief in myself before there's any ability or any even evidence that says that I should actually believe the thing that I'm believing in the first place. And if I think a step deeper, it's kind of like, if I can't believe in myself, who else will lend me the strength to believe in myself? In the end, when I have to make those decisions, or when I'm thinking about the things that I myself am optimizing for, in the end, it's just me. And I have to really believe in myself to take that step and do it. Of course, my friends will be there and my friends will help me, like they helped me before in the past year in making my decisions. But in the end, it's still me. I have to clap for myself first, so that other people could, I guess, join in unison. So, belief, being more bold, and belief coming before ability. Another thing I want to work on is making faster decisions. I remember as I was kind of in the pursuit of micro happiness, I was thinking about all the different hobbies I wanted to try. And one hobby that I tried was sewing. Something that maybe a lot of people don't know is that I'm actually really interested in fashion. I love high fashion a lot, and I love designers. Not that I buy them, but I like the idea of art, and I like the idea that these designers are sewing just normal pieces of fabric to try to transcend a message or relay a message to the wearer and create a certain aesthetic that they want to represent with the brand or with their message. And I think that's really beautiful, even though a lot of it, honestly, I don't understand. I'm very much a novice when it comes to high fashion or designer or whatever. But anyways, I wanted to take up sewing. And I remember when I wanted to take up sewing, I sat there and kind of like hemmed and hawed for probably like 2 months, where I just thought about, oh, I should totally sew. Oh, no, I shouldn't sew. Oh, I should sew. And I kind of just went in between the two. And then when I finally decided I want to sew, then I spent probably like another month thinking about what the best way of sewing is. I searched all the different sewing classes there were in the area about sewing. And I thought about, oh, I have to buy a machine. And, oh, what sewing machine do I want? Or, oh, what's the best yarn to buy? Or, what's the best fabric? And I just thought about all these different things about sewing. But in the end, I was still not sewing. And when I finally got around to sewing, I just bought a machine off Facebook Marketplace and bought some fabric from a factory nearby. It took me like 2 weeks or like 3 weeks to figure out that sewing's fun, but it's not for me. And essentially, it took me like 3 or 4 months to reach that conclusion that sewing's fun and it's not for me. And most of it, 3 months plus some few weeks, was basically spent on just deciding how or if I want to sew and how I want to do that. And I think this is very much like a very trivial example. Like there's not that much cost involved. Maybe the only cost here is just time wasted. I could have done something else. Or if I figured out earlier that sewing's not for me, I can invest the time in another hobby. So maybe the opportunity cost. An example where this becomes a little bit more intense and where faster decisions are a little bit more important is a decision I made recently between two jobs when moving out to NYC. So I had two jobs that I was choosing between when moving out. And when I received them, I had a really compressed timeline of 2 weeks. I guess 2 weeks isn't that compressed, but I had 2 weeks to decide which one I wanted to take. And I was thinking about which one to take for the entirety of the 2 weeks. I basically did nothing during that time. And throughout this entire time, I was essentially just torturing myself with the condition. I was thinking about all the different frameworks that I could use. I could use the Ikigai framework. I could use the pros and cons. I could think about regret minimization. I was just throwing so many of these different frameworks at this decision and trying to get it perfect to make my absolute decision between these two ideal and kind of to jujitsu my mind in making the best decision. Now, this is not to say I should make a faster and more rash decision without considering kind of a good deal of fact. But this is to say that I spent 2 weeks on this, and I would probably look back and argue now that a lot of those 2 weeks were basically just wasted. I could have done so much more in those 2 weeks. I could have actually started traveling a little bit more since I quit my job already, and I really just had freedom to do whatever I want before I moved to New York. I could have spent more time looking for a place to live at in New York instead of just panicking and finding a place last minute. I could have spent more time with friends. I could have just enjoyed the city of Chicago more before I left. There's so many things I could have done, but instead I just tortured myself for 2 weeks thinking about the decision. And this is aptly termed, again, from Modern Wisdom Podcast, where he calls it the anxiety cost. It's kind of like the anxiety that you have in terms of making this decision. And by putting this decision off and putting so much mental strain into it, essentially it's kind of like opportunity cost that you're no longer using this time in other things that you could have thought about. But yeah, so this is all to say the sewing example and choosing between the two jobs is that I need to work on making faster decisions. That's just what it is. I can't spend so much time, so much mental fortitude or so much energy on just one decision. And maybe to finish us off is a shift in mindset that I want to work on in this sense. The shift in mindset is being directionally correct over being optimally correct. I think I'm always so focused on making the best decision, and often enough, the effort doesn't really justify how good the decision is because the decision is between options that are like not really different anyways. It's like choosing between, do you want to eat at that Japanese restaurant or do you want to eat at that Korean restaurant? Like they're not super different. The decision's not going to matter anyways. So it's a really shift in mindset between just making a good decision and then believing that the good decision that's made will lead to more good decisions, which will lead to better decisions and great decisions and hopefully phenomenal conditions later down the line. So it's kind of like the compounding of good decisions over time that leads you to an optimally correct place. Finally, maybe to cap it off, another thing that I want to really look on to improve or think a lot about is risk aversion. So I've always been really risk adverse, and this is something that's been plaguing me a lot during university. I remember my first year, I had two options. One was joining a startup incubator with kind of like this dumb idea that I had, but I got an offer from a startup incubator that I could have joined, or to work for the government for a minimum wage research job. And for me, being university, I thought about, oh my God, look at all the money that I can make at this minimum wage job in Canada versus the incubator, which honestly I would be paying money to go because it doesn't like the amount doesn't cover rent. Like it's not enough to cover rent. It's just essentially covers food. But thinking back, I should have just picked the startup incubator because it was definitely, I don't want to say a once in a lifetime experience, but a very, very rare experience that sometimes even now I think about and I wonder, who I would be if I actually took that small opportunity back then. Not that I would be something greater, but the enrichment of experiences that I would have now, and maybe the compounding effect of trying to do a startup that early on when I didn't really know anything versus kind of just sitting around in an office in a cubicle all day doing nothing because government jobs, you don't really do anything anyways. But this is all to say that I've always been really risk adverse. And looking ahead, I want to take a little more risk. I want to be in better grips the uncomfort, the pain, the uncertainty of taking more risks. I think that is something that I'm not good at, and that's something I definitely want to work on. And I guess that with taking more risk comes the responsibility of handling losses as well, right? Because the whole point of risk is that there's upside, but there's also downside. So it's understanding that I could experience much more downside and being okay with that. And of course, this greater downside is needed to have greater upside. You need to take on more risk to get a higher reward. So, wrap it up. Three things I want to look at going forward is the belief, making faster decisions, and being less risk adverse, being more risk seeking. Yeah, and that's it. Thanks for listening. Expect something like this every week. I'm looking to release one every Sunday. So, yeah, there'll be episodes like this, whether it's just me reflecting or another guest, which will come out every Sunday morning. A special thanks for all those who stayed this far into the first episode. There's probably a really good drinking game that you could play in this first episode where you take a shot every single time I say thoughts, and you'll probably be pretty drunk no matter what liquid you drink. But yeah, big thanks. And I'll see you next week.